This episode of Literary Treks is brought to you by Audible.com, offering more than 180,000 titles for smartphone, tablet, and desktop. To get a free audiobook of your choice and to help Trek FM at the same time, visit audibletrial.com/trekfm. And also by Enterprise in Space, an international program of the nonprofit National Space Society. Find out how you can help science and education and become a virtual crew member aboard the NSS Enterprise Orbiter by visiting enterpriseinspace.org. And if you want to join the conversation and share your thoughts on this episode, join the Babel Conference, our listeners group on Facebook. Just type BABEL into the Facebook search field. We look forward to seeing you there.
Hey everyone, I'm Rod Roddenberry, and you're listening to Trek FM.
Are you taking all these books? I thought I'd take some light reading, in case I got bored.
Welcome to episode 221 of Literary Treks, your official Star Trek books and comics show here on the Trek FM network. I'm just one of your hosts, Bruce Gibson, and with me, all the way from Canada, because I'm in the United States, so that's why all the way over there, that way, up there, that way, is Dan Gunther. Dan, how are you?
Not too bad. Greetings from America's hat. How's it going?
I guess we're North America's underwear.
Sure.
I don't know. I'm doing good. Well, if you're a hat, then we're the face.
Something like that. Yeah.
Anyway.
We're your polite upstairs neighbor.
That's true. That's true. So welcome. Yes. You know what? On today's feature, we're going to talk about the wonderful novel Spock's World that came out years and years and years ago. It's an early novel. And Justin Oser from Trek FM's Earl Grey will be joining us. So I'm really looking forward to diving into that book because I read that a long time ago.
Yeah, me too. I'm not that long ago, a couple of years ago for me, but really stuck out in my mind as one of the better Star Trek novels. So I'm curious to see what Justin thinks about it. And I'm really looking forward to our discussion about that one.
Me too. And then after that, at the end of the show, we have an iTunes review. And so we'll read that and call that person out. And when I say call that person out, meaning like, if it's a bad review, you got to listen to the end of the show, everyone, because if it's a bad review, that's when it's going to get really interesting because we're going to call that person out. But if it's a great review, we'll also call that person out. So,
I'm curious. I hope it's a good review. That's scary.
This is our tease. You have to stay tuned later when we go through all that stuff about listening to us in other places and things. So
stay tuned, everyone, to hear what someone thinks about us.
Yes, check that out. So let's go ahead and talk about news before we get to that and into the feature. So we have an announcement about a new comic series. Well, a mini series, I should say, a story arc, like Noah's Ark, but with a C instead of a K. But a new story arc from IDW, and it's called Through the Mirror.
Ooh.
And this is a series that is spun off from Mirror Broken.
That's exciting. Mirror Broken, I think, was a highlight of Star Trek comics last year. So to get a sequel to that, something that as far as I know anyway, the sales of Mirror Broken were quite good and people critically responded to it quite well. So maybe not a surprise that it's getting a sequel, but very, very welcome news for sure.
Yeah, and it's the same writers and the same artists. So Scott Tipton and David Tipton will be writing it. And also J.K. Woodward will be doing the art, just like with the other series. So this is 5 issues, and it's a 5-week event, and it's going to be in the month of May here in 2018. So the story takes place in the Mirror universe, but they get to encounter their Prime universe counterparts. So this is the first to see a matchup of the Mirror and the Prime universe TNG casts together.
Very cool. We'll have to get Amy Nelson back on to talk about these, I think. You know, it's tradition at this point, right?
Do you think she'd want to come on?
I don't know. I there may have been some rumblings on Twitter that she might maybe be excited about coming on to talk about those, but I don't know. Maybe that's actually just her Mirror Universe counterpart trying to throw us off the trail or something.
Well, that tweet that you're talking about is how I initially found out that this series was coming. That was my clue. I was like, what is she talking about? And then I was looking further. I was like, oh, yeah. And I saw IDW make the announcement and IGN broke the news. So pretty exciting. So, of course, like you mentioned, Dan, we'll be covering that here on Literary Treks because that's what we do. We cover the comics.
Excellent.
And the books and the comics and the books and the comics. So let's go ahead and go into the feature and talk about a book.
Sounds good. I will see you there.
Spock's World came out in September of 1988. And we're going to discuss it here in 2018. How exciting is that? It's been 30 years since this book came out. This is the 30th. Am I doing my math correctly?
You are.
Absolutely.
Dan's look on his face is kind of like, really?
No, that was me reflecting on, wow, 30 years. That's insane. And I don't want to think about how old I am now, but.
Yeah, well, that's a good point. Yeah, just the look on your face, I thought you were like, is he sure it's 30 years? But yeah, I can't believe it's 30 years. Well, this September will make it 30 years. And with us to discuss this book is Justin Oser from Earl Grey. How are you doing there, Earl Grey man?
I'm doing very well and happy to be here discussing this particular novel today.
Excellent.
Yes.
Happy to have you on. Absolutely.
Oh, thank you. I know it's been a few months.
Do you read Star Trek books?
A few, maybe every week. About
every week, because your challenge is to read every Star Trek novel.
It absolutely is. So currently I'm at 154. I think I have 600 some odd to go, plus any that come out in the ensuing years that it takes me to get there. So that 154 has been in. It'll be 4 years later this year that it's taken to get to that point, and many more years of Trek novels to go, and I'm happy about that. But yeah, my goal is to read every official Star Trek novel and short story collection.
Interesting.
That's
so
exciting.
You're probably kind of appreciating a little bit this hiatus that we're on at the moment for new Star Trek novels.
Actually, yeah. I mean, I know for the people out there that have read all of them, they're like, oh, no new Star Trek novels. But for me, yeah, it's a chance to catch up, because when they were coming out like once a month, it was like, okay, I'd get 3 ahead and then I'd have to read one more instead of, 4 in a month or something like that. So yeah, it gives me a chance to catch up a bit. Although it's still going to take, I don't know, 12, 15 years to do the rest of it probably.
Well, still, I mean, you've knocked a good chunk out. That's pretty impressive.
I've had to really dedicate pretty much all of my, reading that I do in my free time to Star Trek novels. But when I get, a goal like that, I'm going to do it to the end. So, yeah.
That's so great. Yeah. I'm with you. I want to do that. I always said I was going to do it, and I've just fallen behind over time.
Well, you've chosen to read some other stuff. You read Star Wars novels and other stuff. I read only Star Trek novels, so.
Yeah. Yeah. That's almost what you have to do if you're going to try to read them all. And we're not helping things, because you read Spock's World, maybe last fall?
It was about a year and a half ago, like late 2016.
Oh, okay.
Yeah, so I reread it, so you're knocking me one behind.
Oh, no, man.
I love it because I love this novel so much, so I don't mind rereading a few here and there.
Well, I'm glad you love this novel so much, so tell us, just briefly, just to start things off, what is it that you love so much about this novel?
Let's see. So, one of the things is Diane Duane's writing style. I mean, actually, I've only read one other Diane Duane novel, which is Dark Mirror, but she has a way with descriptions and opening books and chapters that just kind of gives you a feeling of, the immensity and beauty of, space and planets forming and all kinds of things. So I love her writing style. But then also, the two things here, Vulcan's past and Vulcan's present, are just totally fascinating to see what she's adding to what we know about the history of Vulcan and about Vulcans. And it's just really compelling the way that she kind of weaves that together and kind of makes it into a whole, even though there are, two very different time periods often going on here. And also, I love in particular one part, the philosophy of Sarek is just, it's beautiful the way that she's written it, and it really just feels profound and moving. So there's just so many different elements. I think I said before the recording, we could talk about this probably for 10 podcasts and not cover it all, because there's just so much going on and so much that I love about it. I just enjoyed every moment, rereading the novel.
Yeah. And you're right. It's got these two different aspects to it. It's what's happening in the present day of taking place sometime after the motion picture. I'm guessing a few years, maybe, because we've got another refit of the Enterprise.
Yeah, I think it's supposed to be a few years after. Yeah.
And then the other storyline are different stories taking place in the history of Vulcan. And Dan, you put in our notes two books in one.
Well, it's a bargain. You are getting 2 books. Absolutely. No, it's really interesting because in alternating chapters in this book, you have one chapter set in, quote unquote, the present day. And those chapters are all labeled Enterprise. So in that storyline, you've got this planet-wide referendum to consider the question of Vulcan secession from the Federation, which is interesting how that all comes about and how that unweaves throughout the story. And then this second story, the alternating chapters are titled Vulcan. And starting from the very beginning, like the formation of the star and the planets, that make up the 40 Eridani system where Vulcan is, all the way up through to Sarek's tenure as ambassador to the Federation from Vulcan. So you've got all of these chapters, and each one is just kind of this snippet of kind of a little glimpse into the life of a Vulcan or a couple Vulcans at various points throughout Vulcan's history. And, you talked about how expansive and how epic Diane Duane is able to make this universe feel in this book. And man, does that ever come across in those chapters. Like you said, just the feeling of scope and immensity, it makes this feel really real, like a real place where real people evolved and created a civilization. It's hard to put into words exactly the feelings this book generates.
And some of those chapters, I think, especially some of the early ones, feel very cinematic to me. Like you can imagine it as a movie about Vulcan where you're seeing all of these scenes of the formation of the star and of the planet and time passing, and then, looking at the planet as a whole and kind of zooming down to look at these, one person or group of people. That's the thing that I love about her writing. It's oftentimes not like start chapter and there's some dialogue or, some regular description. It really feels just vivid and like I can really imagine it like as a movie in my head.
Mm-hmm. It's almost like you could not just see Vulcan, but smell it. And what I mean by that is just because it's like all your senses take over. It's like, because you really do feel like you're really getting a good sense of what it's like to be there. It's just not a picture. It's just not a description of a few colors and a few objects that are around, but it really seems to go really deep into describing what is there and how it's there and why it's there and just the whole sense of it all. I mean, it is true. I mean, there's times I've read some of her books where I feel like it goes on a little too much, but some books I can go sit down and just fly right through it. This is one of those books where you just have to say, no, wait a second. I'm going to take my time. Mm-hmm. I'm just going to immerse myself deeply into this and just take your time and read it. And once you start doing that, you just fall into it. And the words they're not even words anymore. They're just sensations. Well, I'm getting very zen here.
No, but it's very accurate. You're absolutely right. Those are the feelings that this book kind of inspires. And, I found myself thinking a lot, especially during those Vulcan chapters of, when televised Trek came the closest to describing Vulcan like this. And it really wasn't until the 3-parter Enterprise episode where, it finally felt like there was some of that wonder and immensity of the Vulcan culture and the history of Sarek and even before that, like just the idea of this, desert that's tested Vulcans for millennia. And, we never really got that till those Enterprise episodes. And this book is just, oh man, it's so good.
Yeah, that's a good connection because, you do see some of that scope and some of the kind of the feelings and sensations of Vulcan in that arc, which is one of my favorite things in Star Trek. And I actually thought about that, quite a bit because T'Pau has a place in this book, and I'm thinking about the younger T'Pau as well. So yeah, I think that's very appropriate.
And I'm glad you mentioned Enterprise because this book, as we mentioned earlier, was written and published in 1988. And of course, Enterprise came much later, starting in 2001. And I hadn't thought about it until you said it, but when I was reading the book, visually, I kept referring back to Enterprise more than any other series. So it kept making me reflect to Enterprise, but Enterprise wasn't even in existence at the time of the writing of this book. So it's really interesting. And Dan, have you read this book before? We didn't cover that.
I read this a few years ago, still fairly recently. I'd say maybe 2 or 3 years ago, when I was living overseas and, looking for new things to read. And it was really easy to download Star Trek novels onto my e-reader. So this was one that, of course, a lot of people over the years have said is an incredible Star Trek novel. So I thought, what the heck, I'll add that to my list and read it. And I was not steered wrong, and which led me to read all of Diane Duane's novels after that. So,
you've read all the ones she's written?
I have, yeah,
oh, wow.
Since then, yeah. And her style of writing, it's just so easy to get immersed in. And I would say of all of them, this one is my absolute favorite. Actually, a couple of years ago, Dayton Ward put out solicitations for the Star Trek novel, if you only read one, you should read, and why. And I wrote a pretty impassioned defense for this novel, being like, if you could only read one Star Trek novel, this is probably the one.
Yeah, I think that's a good call. I don't know exactly when I read this, but it was early in my Star Trek reading, which would have been the early 90s. And I have the hardcover book here, and the original price on the inside cover was $16.95, but I have a price tag on the back that shows I bought it at an outlet for $3.99.
Nice.
Very nice.
So, yeah, I would say probably by the time I read this, the book had been out for about probably 6 years at that point. But so we did reach out to Diane, and there were some discussions of her trying to join us, but she has the flu this week. So, that's unfortunate. And I know she's feeling better, and she may be listening to the show. I don't know, but we may hear her on a future episode about one of her other books. So that would be pretty exciting too. So let's go ahead and get into the two aspects of the book. We'll start on the Vulcan side of things, and then we'll get in more present day Enterprise. So, as we mentioned, we really explore Vulcan through its history of really at the start of Vulcan all the way up to pretty much close to present day. And so we'll go through each of the ones, not in really great detail, because like Justin said, we would be here for 10 episodes. And I have to get up early in the morning. I can't stay up all night recording 10 episodes. So let's talk about that evolution that we were talking about. That's Vulcan 1 in the book. Now, for me, that was probably my least favorite of them, But I think it's one of those ones that once I got deep in the book, I realized I should go back and reread it because I'm so used to a certain style of book and I wasn't thinking about what style this is. And so I was going in expecting one thing and not another because it's been forever since I read the book. So what'd you guys think?
I thought it was a really interesting way to start the book off. Like you said, it's definitely outside the norm for Star Trek novels. It seemed, the first time I was reading this, it seemed odd, like, oh, okay. But it really does. I mean, it's Spock's world. It is the history of Vulcan from the very beginning. I thought it was a fun way to introduce the idea.
Yeah, I actually love that first Vulcan chapter. I mean, for all the reasons I was describing before, but the first time I read it, it really pulled me in because it was quite different from what I've read in other Star Trek novels, and it gave me this really vivid description. And I think it's a bold choice to make because basically in that chapter it's talking about the formation of the star and the planet and Takut, I think it is, if that's how you pronounce it, the of the sister planet, and it ends before it can talk about any life really at all. So I thought that was a bold choice, but I really like it. And it really kind of drew me in and was one of the first things I loved about I loved it from before that because there's a little before, but I like that chapter a lot.
Well, especially if you're into astronomy and I mean, this is science fiction. So it really dives into that whole creation of how this planet and its solar system and such were created. It got to a point where I started feeling like I was reading a history book, even though this isn't real history. But once I got into that frame of mind, it started working for me more. Mm-hmm. Like this is something that actually happened and it felt so real. And I think that's a good setup to the book because it gets to what we were talking about before, where it just feels deep and real. It feels like Vulcan is a real planet. It doesn't feel like it's made up.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, no, and that goes to what we were talking about before, that it really does make it feel real. Like I almost with this first chapter felt like I was, picking up a book off a library shelf in the 23rd century, all about the origins of Vulcan and that sort of thing. Like it really creates this verisimilitude in that universe that I really loved.
Well, and the book starts with a prologue, and that's not what we're talking about here, but the prologue is in present day. And then it goes to Enterprise 1, Vulcan 1, Enterprise 2, Vulcan 2, so on and so forth. And so we're kind of jumping all over the place, and we're going to focus on the Vulcan 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, and then we'll hit the Enterprise one. So then at this point, past this chapter, we would be into Enterprise 2, going now into Vulcan 2. And these are the early Vulcans. These are the ones that almost like prehistoric, like the cavemen, but not like cavemen, but there's a guy that's a wanderer. There are tribes, and he wanders in far off places and such. And he even interacts with a creature that's almost like they refer to as almost kind of being like a dinosaur.
That lives under the sand, right? Is that?
Yeah.
Yeah. Did anyone else kind of picture the sandworms from Dune? Because I couldn't really shake that image out of my head.
I did. I thought of that, and I also thought of Star Wars Rebels. There was just something about this story that reminded me of the current storyline in Rebels and how they interact with basically the nature of creatures on a certain planet that's been going on this season. So it kind of reminded me of that because this creature is communicating with them.
I have a question about some of these chapters that are about like the prehistory of Vulcan before they really write anything down, because it seemed like at first I was like, oh, this is supposed to be as if you're, omniscient and you could be there. But some of it seemed like a little simplified, that things could happen that way or happen that quickly. So it made me wonder if instead of trying to actually be what would happen, if this would have been more the kind of myths and stories that Vulcans have. What do you guys think?
That's possible. I didn't really take it that way when I read it.
I didn't take it that way when I read it, but now that I think about it and how simplified it is, I'm thinking, I wonder if that's more the intention, because it seemed like a little simple, like this one guy is so important and institutes so much change, and all of a sudden, like the next day, they have language and songs and stuff, so...
No, that's a good point. it's almost as if the first chapter starts off, like I said, for me, like a history book. It's the history, and then these are more like myths, Vulcan myths, that there's some truth, but they're legends. There's always a bit of truth in a legend, but it might not be entirely true, because some of it's a little odd in the fact that there's a creature kind of speaking, in a sense, to this
And that comes up
wanderer.
later in other chapters, right?
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. But it's interesting, too, because they use telepathy in a lot of ways to communicate with each other, not language. And as he sees Mount Salea and some other things, he's trying to describe it back to his people, and he can't really get them to understand because he can't explain things in words.
It's like he can only send images. I almost imagined his mind was like, sending a JPEG to them, and they were like downloading it and looking at this image. That's what it felt like, because they were talking about like mental pictures. But
Yeah, no, that's that whole chapter, this second chapter for me, I really loved the imagery in it. Especially the way it was written from the perspective of someone who doesn't have the experience or the language to describe what he's seeing when he first encounters Mount Salea, for example, and just the immensity of it, kind of explaining, even just first seeing the sky, on a regular, like the immensity of the sky and Takut in the sky after having lived under trees his entire life. Just the idea of this canopy that's, you can see the sky a bit through it, but until you get out of it, you don't realize how immense it is, and Takut in the sky. This imagery is just so good. And I really liked that idea of, like you said, sending images or that kind of thing. They don't yet have the language or the experience to put a context to the new things that he's discovered.
So I'm wondering if you guys thought what I was thinking when I was reading this. I thought, this is probably the start of Sarek's story, that this wanderer's him. Did you think that at any point?
no.
Because I was like thinking maybe this was getting to...
Well, this felt like much further back in history than we know that Sarek would. I didn't actually have that thought. No, I mean, it felt like somebody who was, I don't know, hundreds of thousands or millions of years before, something like that.
Yeah, I got the feeling this was like very early tribal Vulcans, way before that. And Sarek was only, a couple thousand years ago, something like that.
1,500 years ago, something like that.
Yeah, that's not that long ago.
Well, on
scheme of
on
things.
geological timescales and rise of species, that's not very long ago at all.
That is so true. So true.
I think one thing that's interesting about that chapter is it sets up the outsider or the person who thinks different as like an engine for change in Vulcan society. Whereas, we're used to seeing or thinking about Vulcans as pretty much the same, trying to, as they put in this book, master their emotions instead of suppress their emotions, and that, believe in the philosophy of Sarek and nonviolence and all of that. But you're getting to see in these chapters an earlier form, and that the in order to get to the Vulcans that we know, like from the original series, that there needs to be these outsiders or people that think different that institute some kind of change. I thought that was interesting.
Yeah, absolutely. And Dan, I know that you have mentioned that they're not a monolithic society like we typically think of Vulcans.
Yeah, that's one of the things that I really enjoyed about this book is, up until, this point in Star Trek, Vulcans are, pretty much all the same. Like Sarek is, the stereotypical Vulcan, totally without emotion as far as we know, and incapable of lying, and always do the right thing, and are very, emotionless and staid and logical. And Spock is, always striving to that, if not, outright showing that at all times. And this book, I found, especially in the Enterprise chapters, when we see more, even post Sarek's reformation, there are still lots of Vulcans that follow, different strands of what the book calls Sathia, or what we translate supposedly as logic. different Vulcans take different ideas from that, but, and there's a few that follow it by the letter and very closely, but as many different Vulcans as there are different ways of following Sarek's teachings and being Vulcan, which I thought was really interesting.
And that's one of the things I loved about this novel, is that you got to see so many different Vulcans from different time periods, and even in the present day Enterprise chapter, you get to see a lot of different types of Vulcans and different, even ways that they might look or might act, and I mean, up to this point, I think you hadn't seen much of that, because for the most part, it was like it's Spock or it's Sarek or a little bit here and there. Maybe it's, T'Pau or some other Vulcans, but you didn't really get to see much. So you get to see like this whole kind of diverse planet of Vulcans, and it's great. And you can do that best in a novel, I think.
Yeah, and again, that gets back to what we were talking about earlier. It makes things feel more real, more rich. It seems more believable, because not all Vulcans are the same. And to me, again, it refers back to Enterprise. When I was reading this, it's like, this just shows you that, when Enterprise came out, a lot of people complained, the Vulcans don't act that way. Vulcans aren't like that. Well, not all Vulcans are the same. They're like a pack of lifesavers. There's different flavors of Vulcans.
Vulcan lifesavers.
There's even a blonde Vulcan who's a real jerk.
Yeah.
That's true. Oh my gosh. Yes, we're going to get to that one later. So let's go to 3, Vulcan 3. This was my favorite of the Vulcan stories. I don't know why. It was just about this tribe, and there's different tribes throughout Vulcan. And I got the sense that there's a particular geographical area of the planet Vulcan where a lot of these tribes are, but, water is very scarce. And so they congregate around different areas where some water is, and there isn't much water where this tribe is. And there's this one character named Kesh, and she's very much of the opinion of, there's this other tribe that's near a great water supply, and we should go over there, and we should take over, and we have an advantage because this tribe, she and others in the tribe have this different aspect to their eyes where they can see in the bright sun, where other Vulcans on the planet have a hard time seeing in the brightness of the sun, so they have to hunt at night. They have the ability, this tribe, to go out there during the day and hunt and see. So they feel like they have this advantage over this other tribe, but this oldest mother who runs the tribe says, no, we shouldn't do that, and we shouldn't, so on and so forth. I don't want to go too far into it, but I really enjoyed this story, and I was just wondering what you guys thought.
Yeah, this was another really great chapter. I really like that character of Kesh and seeing things from her perspective. And also, just tying into continuity, the idea of Vulcans having an inner eyelid is something that came up in the original series. So we see the origins of that here, which is, just a nice little touch. And I love stuff like that.
Yeah, because not all Vulcans have it, but this tribe, we're seeing that start to develop.
Mm-hmm. And eventually, of course, presumably their genes will spread throughout the whole population, and then all Vulcans will. So it's really cool. And yeah, this, kind of origin of intertribal warfare here. And we see Vulcan moving in that direction of becoming a bit of a more martial society and more aggressive towards each other.
Yeah, I thought it was a really interesting chapter. I mean, I guess one thing we didn't mention is in the previous chapter, when there's this wanderer that brings language and advances things in that way. Shortly thereafter, there's a solar flare that basically burns a lot of the vegetation on the planet. So in this chapter, it leads to all of this scarcity and all of these conflicts. So I like that it's kind of laying the groundwork. And what's really great about this is it builds it up, because there's the start of that kind of conflict and warfare that just kind of builds and builds until it kind of reaches a climax, several Vulcan chapters later. So it's not like it's trying to just wrap up, here's the conflict and it got really bad, but it just kind of builds it up, and this is kind of the start of that. And I like that it's laying the groundwork, and it was very interesting just to see, and you can do this in a novel, to have all of these discussions within the tribe. What's the best thing to do? We should do this, we should do that. Time passes, something happens, I just love that. like within this novel, like Diane Duane is taking the time to really kind of build the framework and just, you know, have everything just kind of, you know, breathe and happen naturally. Nothing at all feels rushed in here to me. And I really love that. I mean, especially in this chapter, it could have been a short thing like, we need water, let's take it. But it was a much like longer discussion and progression over the course of some years.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, it's very, like you said, she goes into great depth into everything. But at the same time, I get the feeling that there's not a single wasted part either. Like every single line in every chapter feels necessary to the story too, because like there's no extraneous stuff. There's no fluff. It's all building this story, and it's just a great story.
Well, a lot of authors are given deadlines. To me, it felt as if they told her, take as much time as you need.
Do you know the story behind this novel?
No.
Yeah, so
do tell.
So, you know, Voyages of the Imagination, which is an amazing compilation of all Star Trek, you know, novels and short stories up to 2006. So they interviewed a number of authors, and one of the authors they interviewed was Diane Duane for Spock's World. And basically she was almost done the week before it was due, and she was doing it on a computer in the late 80s, and her hard drive crashed. She lost most of it and had to rewrite 60,000 words of it within a week. So a lot of what you're reading, she had to write in a very short span of time and under a lot of pressure, which is extraordinary because it's so good. And for that to have happened, and I think in the interview, she said she felt that because she had to rewrite a lot of it, that it actually turned out better than before.
Wow, that's incredible. I hadn't heard that. That's amazing.
It really is. I mean, especially considering we're praising it so much and we love it so much. I mean, she had this big thing happen where she lost a lot of it and had to rewrite it quickly.
I have to say, I used to really admire Diane Duane and think she's an amazing writer. Now I'm kind of scared of her. That's amazing.
But now that makes sense in a lot of ways, because I've been in situations in the past where I've had something I wrote and I lost, or what similar situation, and then you're just going off memory and things are coming back. But then the second time you write it, you feel like it actually turned out better, because it's almost like you're improving upon what you've already done.
Mm-hmm.
So maybe that's really interesting. And I'm sure I read that because I have the book you're talking about, which is an incredible book to get because there's so much insight.
It was like 800 pages.
Novels.
You can't remember all of it.
Right.
But yeah, I mean, when I read that, I was like, wow, that's pretty incredible, because I think if I had written this, you know, this kind of novel and I had lost it, I think I just would have been like, I don't even know what to do now.
I mean, that happened to me in university when I lost a 12-page paper and I had, I think, a day still to rewrite it. And like, that was bad enough. I can't even imagine. Oh, there would be so many tears.
Did you feel like you wrote it better?
Maybe. I honestly don't know in that case.
Well, I just want to let you know that I just realized we are not recording, so we're going to have to redo this whole show over again, so it'll be even better. No, I'm kidding. Of course, if everybody's hearing this, you know we're recording. So, Vulcan 4. This one to me was a little strange. I enjoyed it, but it was a little different because there's this character here who has this mind power that when she's bonding with her mates, her mind power is killing them.
It can happen at other times too, right? If she gets really angry. That's the sense I got.
Yeah. Mm-hmm. Like the Incredible Hulk.
Yeah. It was, wow. Yeah. When I got to this one, I mean, of course, I'm rereading it, but I'd forgotten about it. I was like, wow, killing with your mind, you know, that really takes it to another level. I mean, and it's something that I think later on they end up, you know, selling some of this talent and all this stuff, but it's not something that we really know about from what's on screen, right? The power to just, for Vulcan to just kill someone with their mind, as far as I remember. So it was kind of interesting to read about that.
Yeah, definitely some interesting things that seem to at least maybe not contradict, but at least aren't really corroborated by anything we've seen on screen. So it's kind of interesting that, to me, and I mean, I'm going to bring out the dreaded C word in Star Trek canon. it feels like the book deviates a bit from what people would consider canon, but not in any really egregious ways. Just
it's not. I don't think it's necessarily
basically
contradicted by anything that's on screen. It's more like, wow, this is some incredible thing that they had to suppress, I guess. Although, actually, I recently watched the Gambit two-parter in The Next Generation. There is actually a Vulcan weapon where you can kind of focus and kill with the power of your mind, so that might support it a little bit.
I had that thought about that while reading this as well. The idea of killing with a thought, aided by technology, yes, but still that similar idea for sure.
And it wasn't as if all the Vulcans have this ability. It's unique to her.
Well, and then it spreads somewhat through the gene pool, right?
Yeah.
There's different. Later on, we get into there's different psi talents that kind of get traded and bartered around, kind of thing. People going to different houses and almost kind of a eugenics kind of breeding type program where, there's traits that are useful. So we're going to breed this family with that family and create, offspring that have that talent and that sort of thing. It's interesting
because I thought of it more like, what you saw in earlier times in Earth, there would be these different powers and different kingdoms, and they'd want, their sons and daughters to marry, and but that I guess was more because they wanted to bond together the different, kingdoms or areas than that, they have some special killing power or something like that. It's quite interesting. But like, I saw it also as, in the previous chapter, they start with warfare, and now they're taking that kind of to like a whole nother level with these mind killing powers that they make use of that can be really devastating. It's kind of like, it's accelerating toward the point that you see with Sarek, where things really kind of get out of hand,
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
Yeah, and that's the thing. I mean, we are talking Vulcans, but it's before Sarek, so we're dealing with emotions and such. And this felt almost like the Shakespearean story of this whole book to me, because you're dealing with this high house and the families, and using one family has her married in and wants to use this to continue through the bloodline as a weapon. And she, I mean, if anybody hasn't figured, we're going into spoilers, but she basically, her husband is then killed and she sacrifices herself, and it's
she kills a bunch of people, and like, whoa.
Yeah.
It's really something. Like, actually, it made me think, like, I could see that happening on Romulus, but of course, I think this is before there's the offshoot, right?
Mm-hmm.
Right,
yeah.
But their bloodline may be the ones that went to.
And I would say these early Vulcans have more in common with Romulans than they do with the later Vulcans too.
Absolutely.
It feels like it, yeah.
Then we get to Vulcan 5, which takes place on a mining ship, and they find diamonds. And I like this story a lot too, because I like the fact that when they found these diamonds, they were rich and they could, basically retire. They don't have to ever work again. And then the old man, the father or whatever of this family that's on this ship is like, no, we got to just keep going. Got to keep working.
The money's got to stay on the ship. It's like, what?
They're like, screw you. We're out of here.
Yeah. Well, and then it escalates and turns into just a whole bloodbath. And then it feels like it's just escalating to another level, because it starts off like a conflict between some different families because they're out there in space. Because they don't really, I guess, have like a military in space. It's more like merchant ships, but some of them have weapons. But it leads to like all of this escalating conflict. It's quite interesting, and it made me think also, like, if Vulcans know about this kind of history and what greed could do, that they would be very much seeing the logic and trying to control that kind of thing, because it could just quickly get out of hand, right?
Mm-hmm. This chapter to me was heartbreaking, because there's a certain point in the chapter where it's inevitable what's going to happen, and what's going to happen, and you just really wish that someone would make a different decision at some point and stop it all from happening. But of course, they're all going to die, and this ship is going to, careen
I mean, do you
off
think it really would have been different if kind of the head of the house was like, yeah, let's split it and go our separate ways? Would it have been okay, or would people it would just have still escalated because everybody wanted to have all of it?
I mean, I hope not. It feels like the way they were talking, there was enough wealth that,
Yeah.
I mean, you hope for the best for people. And, if you put yourself in that situation, I'm like, I think I'd be okay with just my share and just like leave me alone with mine and I'll go.
And there's a war going on, and I feel like they still would have gotten shot down as confusion from.
That could be. But this chapter kind of felt like a Greek tragedy. Like, there's this inevitable thing that's happening, and there's just absolutely nothing you can do because of the actions of some of the characters, and it's just going to happen. It was heartbreaking. That's
it exactly. That's exactly how I felt.
It's interesting going through it chapter by chapter because there's all these different kinds of things going on. It's like, history of the solar system and the planet being formed, and, getting a language, and warfare and conflict, and, traits gone out of control, and greed. I mean, it's like she's doing all these different kinds of stories in each of the chapters, right? They're all each different from each other.
Right. And they're all leading up now to this chapter, which is Vulcan 6, what happens there, Justin? What do we now led up to? This moment.
Yeah, we've led up to the moment where we get to see Sarek, who, it was interesting the first time I read it, I was like, oh, so Sarek's like a computer programmer in an office building. Okay. Like I always imagined he was just, well, I guess because of my view from what we see in that Vulcan arc in Enterprise has colored it, because I'm like, oh, he's just, out in the desert. But yeah, he's just basically like a programmer in an office, and there's kind of this escalating warfare that's happened, but all of a sudden, there is, I guess it's like a matter-antimatter explosion on the sister planet, Takut, and he is just, and like the news moves right past it, like, oh yeah, there's this huge crater, whatever, let's go on to the next thing, and he is just incredibly, profoundly affected by it, and it kind of leads him down the road toward his philosophy. And I think, as I mentioned toward the beginning, this might be my favorite chapter in the entire book, because like I think it's a lot to live up to say, this is the person who is the founder of the most important philosophy that infects Vulcans thousands of years later, and trying to write for that. But the way that Diane Duane writes for it, it's just profound and moving, and like there are parts in there, especially there's like an extended part about casting out fear that feels so incredibly relevant to right now, and has provided just like a lot of inspiration to me ever since I read it. I mean, I think it's some of the best stuff I've read in any novel, Star Trek or otherwise. Just getting into that philosophy, for me it's incredible, and this is like the best part of the whole book for me, at least.
Yeah, this is an incredible chapter. There's so much vivid imagery again in this. The news media thing, for example, felt sadly familiar. Yeah. Like, I mean, you get news reports of, this happened overseas, these people were killed here, this happened here, this, and it's just, wow, does that ever feel familiar? And I think that's very much on purpose, of course. I think Diane Duane is trying to splash a little bit of cold water on the reader as well to make you think, but what's going on Earth. It
feels even more relevant, 30 years later than it would have then.
Absolutely. Yeah. And that's the saddest part too. And then to me, the one part that really struck me, and it's kind of an odd part that just made me, I don't know, empathize with Sarek or something, was where he's taken the family's air car and is just driving, just flying and thinking. And, I've done that sort of thing before where you just take your car down the highway and drive and end up somewhere and then turn around and go home. But he never really goes home. He does return home briefly, but then he sets out to develop this philosophy and figure out a new way for his people. And it's just, it's something that's really, I don't know if inspiring is the right word, but it just really made me get what this guy is all about, and like you said, I wouldn't have expected Sarek to be some computer programmer in an office tower who just has an epiphany one day.
Yeah.
You know,
but that feels real, actually, that kind of thing could
He's
happen.
like us.
That's exactly right. And if you look at all the great heroes, even in our history, a lot of them would probably be very similar to that. You know, like if you knew them on a day-to-day basis, they're just people. They're just people who had an idea. And that's what Sarek is. And I love that.
Yeah, I love that too. And I think, you know, it's even said in the chapter, like, you know, was really nothing special about his family or about him when he was born. He was just a regular person who one day just kind of had enough and had to seek out something different. I mean, and that feels real as well when you see, you know, stories of different, you know, philosophers and great religious figures in the history of Earth. Oftentimes they're just a regular person that just has like this moment where they realize that they need to say something different, you know, in order to spread a certain message. So it felt like very real, like that could happen.
My only complaint with this chapter is that Sarek needs more than a chapter. I really feel that because we're trying to tell his influence and how he changed things within one chapter, it moves fairly quickly, where I'd like to go deeper into that. I almost feel like this chapter needs to be taken out now and expanded upon into its own novel. But the story needed to be told in this book, so it had to stay within the chapter. But I want more, is what I'm getting at. I feel like there could be so much more that goes into him.
Well, what you need to do, Bruce, then, is put together an outline, title it Sarek, and give it to Pocketbooks and see what they say.
Well,
because
if
I
they have a contract, maybe I will.
Are there any? I mean, are there other novels about Sarek or that have him in it?
We've talked about doing Sarek's Soul. Wasn't that?
Yeah, there's an Enterprise novel
yeah.
called Sarek's Soul. I haven't read it, but
yeah, I haven't read it
either.
either, so I'm not sure what
Maybe.
it's all about. But
And I'm sure there's some in some other books. I can't recall. Off the top of my
But
head.
no, I mean, I hadn't thought of it that way, but I'm kind of with you, Bruce, because it was just so captivating. I probably wanted to read about that for an entire novel.
right.
Because it's, wow.
and I think that would be a really great novel. I think that would be an incredible read.
Sarek's World. So then we end with Vulcan 7, which is about Sarek's early career and how he meets Amanda, and with some genetic testing, they're able to have Spock.
Spock's a designer baby, apparently.
Yeah. There was no mention about Michael Burnham, which confused me, or Cybok. I don't know why.
Did anyone else find themselves, trying to put, for example, Michael Burnham in here? I don't think there's a lot of room to fit Cybok in, unfortunately.
Yeah.
There's just too many changes.
What I found myself doing actually was comparing it to the novel Sarek, which has two different things in it. It has a different story for how Amanda and Sarek meet, and also I think Sarek is a good deal older in this novel than he's established to be in the Next Generation. So, I was comparing that, and I was like, no, he's not supposed to yet. But so, yeah.
Yeah, there's other things, like they kept referring to the Federation being around for 180 years. And it wouldn't have been around.
It would have been
maybe 110
Yeah.
ish.
Yeah.
No, 110 maybe.
Yeah.
But anyway.
Yeah, so I found myself comparing it more than that to fit in Michael Burnham. Like with the novel Sarek, I was trying to fit in Michael Burnham and Cybok and all that, which you can be like, oh, there are some, diary entries that we're not seeing because it's a whole life. But yeah, this is a different story. It's like an alternate story of Sarek. And I thought it was really interesting in the way that he meets Amanda and she's already knows the Vulcan language, has been on Vulcan. It actually kind of makes a bit more sense than what we see in Sarek, where she's just been on Earth her whole life. So
because she was working on the Universal Translator in this book. She was one of the developers of that.
Yeah.
Working with specifically the Vulcan translations. Yeah.
Oh, and I love the parts in the novel where they actually took the time to go into certain concepts like logic and God and, suppression of emotion and mastery of emotion. I love that they kind of went into explaining those words and how it would be more accurate in Vulcan, which I think they talk about here too.
Yeah, and what's the word for logic? How do you pronounce it? It's Cthia.
Is it Scythia?
I thought it was Scythia, but that's just kind of how I said it in my head. I do love the definition that they give, and I've highlighted here. Amanda is talking about what the definition for that word is. She says, it's the modern Vulcan word, which we translate as logic, but what it more correctly means is reality, truth. The truth about the universe, the way things really are, rather than the way we would like them to be. And I love that as a concept, because that is something that I think in a lot of public discourse at the moment, and, we can get into that, but I think that concept is missing a lot. The idea of accepting facts and presenting the universe as it is, rather than, this idea of what we want it to be, or molding the universe to fit what we believe or what we think it should be. I like that idea of logic.
It is an ideal, though, because the world or the universe as it is could be very much something that's up to debate and interpretation, and you could see reality different than someone else. I like how they define it here, but like in a certain way on Vulcan, they have to agree to what that means. It's not self-evident what that reality truth is, right? Because there's so many things you have to kind of interpret as you go about your life.
But even at a very basic level, not discounting facts because they're inconvenient, using all the known variables to come up with, and again, like you say, it's an ideal, to come up with the best possible way of looking at it.
And I think the way that they do it is they try to, I think as they say in the novel, master the emotion so that they can kind of look at things a bit from a remove to try to see things a bit more objectively, or to see where their biases come in or are affecting their view of things. So if you're able to do that and say, oh, I probably wanted to set this aside because I have this certain bias, I think you can get closer to a truth. But it's kind of something that, because they have accepted Sarek's philosophy, they're able to do, and I don't know, humans find that more difficult.
Yeah, and in the previous chapter, which we didn't mention, those who didn't follow his teachings, we did see them reject him and leave Vulcan, who, of course, we know become the Romulans. So that was a piece in here about the Romulans that we didn't touch on. So, but yeah, I like what we're talking about here. And again, I think this gets back to her writing. It's not a Vulcan word, or the way the Vulcans use one of our words isn't maybe exactly the definition or how we see things. So when a Vulcan says logic, we think of logic one way. Their definition of logic is slightly different, because we're talking about a totally different race. We're talking about totally different people, population on a different planet. Their views are going to be different, and it just enriches that more. It's just not so black and white. It just gets more gray. It gets more just deep into these different things.
Yeah, and I do love how there's that extended definition of it. It's not just logic, but it's something more than that, or other than that. So if you're trying to see it just as logic, you won't get the whole concept.
Yeah.
And that makes sense, because languages on Earth are like that. There might be a word you might translate a certain way, but a native speaker would say, well, actually, it means this thing, and they'll give you like a whole paragraph about it, right?
And if you take into account a brain that evolved on a different planet entirely, it wouldn't even be as close as they portrayed in Star Trek, obviously, but it would be orders of magnitude different in, idea and concept. And
the one thing before we leave this section about Vulcan is to cut the other planetary,
not a moon,
not a moon. and this is, I think, an answer to what we saw in the motion picture, the artwork that was used when Spock was going through Kolinar and the big planet, because it was mentioned previously that Vulcan has no moons, but yet there's this big looking moon, therefore it must be a planet or whatever. But I like throughout this book, it's almost like the watcher of everything. Yeah. It's almost like these stories are being told as if this planet is observing what's happening and is telling us the story.
Telling the story. Yeah, I like how that was connected in all of the Vulcan sections, and I think it's in some of the Enterprise sections also. It was nice that was... Yeah, it did feel like it was... This sister planet was kind of observing things and telling the story in a way.
Mm-hmm. And those who watch the director's cut of the motion picture, you will not see this. This was redone in the director's cut differently. So.
I love the brief little kind of touch on it early on in the book. Vulcan has no moon, various Vulcans have been heard to remark. Accurate as always when speaking scientifically. Damn right it doesn't, at least one Terran has responded. It has a nightmare.
Because it's so huge in the sky, right?
Exactly, yeah.
Well, I also thought of Spock in Star Trek 09, seeing Vulcan destroyed from Delta Vega, that, maybe that's the same planet, just under a different name, and that's why it's so close and he can see Vulcan explode or implode or whatever you want to call it. But so we spent a lot of time with Vulcan. So... And we're already an hour into this discussion. So
yeah.
Now we got a whole nother section of this, which is present day. But I don't think we need to spend as much time because it's 8 chapters, but it's one story. It's not all these various stories. And so, Dan, I think you said this is one of your favorite parts of the book.
Yeah, definitely. And I mean... My favorite part of the book happens to be the part of the book that I'm reading at the time. I kind of discovered while reading this because there's just so many great things in this. So we've got, Vulcan is threatening secession. There's going to be a planet-wide referendum. But before that happens, there's a series of debates, sort of debates, basically talks given by people to kind of argue for one side or the other. Should Vulcan secede or should Vulcan not secede? And these speeches for me in particular are just such great parts of the book. And I have to give a special shout out to Dr. McCoy's. I think it's one of the most well-written character pieces in Star Trek novels anywhere. And I don't know about you guys, but I heard DeForest Kelley giving those lines on stage.
Oh, yeah. And
so good.
The speech that McCoy, I mean, there are some great speeches in here. But the speech by McCoy against secession is absolutely incredible. I mean, it's one of the most well-written, speeches that I've ever seen anywhere. And just like the background that they give also, that McCoy has had this RNA course to be able to kind of speak Vulcan more like a native, and he throws in that stuff in the language. Man, I want to see... the movie of this where DeForest Kelley is speaking Vulcan while he's doing the speech.
Can you imagine? I know, I couldn't imagine just him speaking Vulcan just so fluently.
Yeah.
And even it's touched upon here that it's a different dialect from a different region of Vulcan.
Yeah, he's picked up a certain dialect. I mean, what is it like, they take the RNA from a Vulcan from a particular area and he absorbs it. I mean, it was kind of a wild explanation, but I love that. And yeah, the speech that he gives. And, when I first read this book, I was like, what is McCoy going to do that's really going to convince people? But he gets them on his side. And at the end, this auditorium full of Vulcans is giving him a thunderous standing ovation. I actually there was a tear in my eye, oh my God, McCoy is doing that. And he hated Spock, I mean, it was just this whole transformation and yeah, I'm with you, Dan. It was just incredible to read.
And I mean, the other speeches are really good too. Kirk's, of course, is very good. I think McCoy's is the best personally. But again, very similar. It's hard to pin down. This is what a good writer can do. It's hard to pin down exactly how McCoy sounds so much like McCoy and how Kirk sounds so much like Kirk. But there's just this slight difference in how they're written that it's so good. And this whole scene, it felt to me like they were kind of TED Talks on Vulcan because, the format's a little different. It's not like a debate like we would have in debate club in high school or something like that. It's,
although people can shout from the audience apparently to object.
Yeah, yes. Which was interesting. So, a little different.
Which didn't seem very Vulcan to me.
There was a lot of laughter from the Vulcan crowd as well. And I was like, interesting.
Yeah, little pieces like that felt a little different. But again, that idea that this is a planet full of very different people that have different interpretations and stuff.
Apparently there's like
really
14.5 billion of them. So
yeah.
yeah, when I saw that toward the end, I was like, wow, that's a lot of Vulcans. So, I mean, you've got to figure that some of them might be different or might feel more relaxed or act differently in this kind of situation. But it struck me like...
Again, they're not all the same. That's what's so beautiful about this.
Yeah.
To say something like, oh, Vulcans don't act that way. Well, no, because not all Vulcans are the same. You look at a human and one human acts differently than another, and there's different cultures of humans and such. It just totally makes sense.
One part in here that I really loved, and again, this flashed me right back to that Enterprise 3-parter, was this idea of, why are the Vulcans so, and I don't want to use this word necessarily, but why are they so afraid of humans? Like seems to be feeding a lot of the sentiment for the Vulcans who want to secede, is this fear of humans. And why is that? And there's a line, it says, a species that maybe reminds you a little too much of yourselves a while ago, confused and angry and afraid. And that's one of my favorite bits from the Enterprise episode, when Admiral Forrest says to Ambassador Soval, are Vulcans afraid of humans? He said, why? And Soval says, well, there is one species that humans remind us of. And Forrest is like, you? And it's the similarities between Earth and Vulcan that are the source of this fear, which I love that as a concept.
On in this book,
yeah, absolutely.
And what's interesting was that, like in McCoy's speech and Kirk's speech, I think as well, they get to like, here is what Sarek had to say, and here is why, by trying to secede, you are not doing things according to his teaching. So I do like that they were kind of bringing out, like, you're wanting to secede because you're afraid of the damage that humans can do to your society, or the damage that they might do elsewhere, and you're part of this federation that's doing damage. But it's almost like they're pointing up, like, you are not following Sarek's teachings to cast out your fear. You are being prey to that fear, even if you don't want to acknowledge it. That's what it is. They're afraid of the influence, and somehow they're also afraid of the infinite diversity as well, which is another of Sarek's teachings. And I love in that chapter how they talk about how he comes, to that epiphany. But that's what was so great, was that it was written in a way that, McCoy, for example, could point up what, Sarek might feel about the situation or what his teachings might be, but it was done in a way that you could believe that the Vulcans who would have an open mind would be convinced by that, which is an incredible accomplishment, because you would think that, they would already have this prejudice against McCoy as a human and trying to, take advantage of their teachings, but they can see his argument is a good one, and really recognize that. I love that, and it makes a lot of sense.
Well, and the thing about this book is, this is called Spock's World. And as we talked earlier, we're getting this history of Vulcan, and that is Spock's world. But this book isn't a Spock book. If anything, to me, in this present day story, this is more of a McCoy story, a Vulcan and McCoy story, because McCoy is the one that has the run-in with the jerk of a Vulcan guy, Sath or whatever his name is. Shath, who's rude and everything, and he starts saying, oh, there's something wrong with this Vulcan, there's something going on. He's the one who goes and does some inspections and goes to the library or whatever he does. He's the one who starts figuring everything out, which we're used to Spock being the one that is logical and putting the things together and kind of solving the mystery. And then it's McCoy that makes really the big speech that's typical of more of Kirk.
Yeah.
And so I felt that Spock and Kirk were basically along for the ride. And McCoy's been, taking this whole thing, and I kept thinking back to her novel, Diane Duane's novel Doctor's Orders, which we covered on here, and it was, and I'm just assuming, and maybe one day I'll ask her if I talk to her about it, but I think McCoy's her favorite character.
That could be. Yeah, it's interesting to think of it that way. And McCoy, basically has a huge part, maybe the largest part in, saving Vulcan from seceding from the Federation. But also, like, if you think about the title Spock's World, Spock's really of two worlds, of Vulcan and Earth. So, I mean, it's interesting for that title. to kind of convey to a reader who's just looking at the cover like, oh, it's about Vulcan and Spock, I'm going to buy that. But I mean, it's not like it's something that's mentioned in there that this is Spock's world. And yeah, I mean, it is like, I think you could be right, Bruce. The two main characters may be Vulcan and McCoy in this one.
And also, I kind of love that interpretation of the title, Spock's World. By the end of this book, it really is a story about Vulcan and its relationship with Earth. So it is kind of about both of Spock's worlds tangentially, anyway.
Yeah, I love that. That absolutely. It's true. So Justin and I were talking earlier before the show on the other side of the page about there's in chapter 2, there's a party planner basically on the Enterprise. And what a job that is. He just plans parties.
Harb Tanzer. Yeah. He's a fun character. I like him, and I could be wrong, but I think he's shown up in a couple of the comics as well, that I think maybe Diane Duane had a hand in writing. I could be wrong about that, but I seem to remember
Oh my gosh, I have to go look that up now.
Yeah, I seem to remember seeing a picture of him in like comic form somewhere, and I should have looked that up before we started, but he does show up in a few different novels, and yeah, definitely an interesting character. That's one of the things with this, you can almost call it the Diane Duane verse, because there are a few differences that she brings in her novels with regards to the Enterprise and how it works, and the characters that are in her books. So, for example, Narat, the Horta, is another crew member that makes frequent appearances in all of Diane Duane's original series books.
Yes,
I want to see that scene with, Narat in the captain's chair when he's like doing command training in this novel. Like, I want to see what his uniform looks like too.
Oh,
I think he's in a couple comics as well.
Oh, really?
I think he is too, because I think I remember him, running around. I don't know how he gets whatever, but with a Delta shield on him.
Yeah.
Yeah.
No
I think
uniform.
There's
just
basically
the
like a
badge.
little vocoder or like voice transmitting thing strapped to him with a little Starfleet insignia on it.
I looked it up, and Harp Tanzer is in the Double Blind comics.
Ah, okay.
As well as a bunch of novels. I think a lot of them, maybe all of them, written by Diane Duane. So,
and if you search Narat, Naraht, Star Trek, you'll get the memory beta entry for him, and it's got a picture of him from a comic in that article.
yes.
Looking it up now.
Me too. Look at us. We're jumping at it right now.
Kind of what
And
you'd
he's-
expect. Rock
He's one of the
creature.
hatchlings, right?
Yeah.
He's one of the ones that were hatched shortly after The Devil in the Dark.
So since we're talking about the Horta crew member, can we talk about the variety of different like species that we see on the crew? Because like I made a note of it, like besides the Horta, there's also this Lieutenant Mashav who's a species called a Sulamid, and it's described as a 7-foot tall pillar of pink-violet tentacles with the waving rosette of stalked eyes on top. And then there's also like a 12-legged, 12-eyed, meter-tall spider named Castilic, I think, who has the memories of like a dead physicist of the same species, like some like wild stuff. And there's also other varieties of non-humanoid crew members. And the question that I had as I was reading this, and I have for you, is like, we don't quite see that kind of diversity in, TOS or even the TOS movies. I mean, did that take you out of it, or did you feel that was odd to have that variety?
Well, it didn't take me out of it. It kind of reminds me of Titan, because they're supposed to be very diverse in the Titan novels. But I think when the motion picture came out, they wanted to be more diverse, and I just felt like it was playing off that. And I think Christopher L. Bennett has kind of run with that too in his post-TMP books.
Yeah, I loved it, but I just wonder what people think, because it's so different from what you see on screen.
Castilic, or however you would pronounce her name, The Wounded Sky by Diane Duane really is her story, and a lot of what she's talking about here refers back to that story when they're talking about making insane modifications to the warp drive and that sort of thing. So That's a really good one if you wanted to bump one up on your list.
Yeah, well, I mean, actually, because I was rereading this, I'm bumping up on my list the Rihansu novels, the Romulan novels. So I'm going to read those next.
Books,
but yeah,
Nurat has some great parts in a couple of those books too. So I won't spoil that. That's excellent.
So I'm probably going to take a month and try to read all of them. So.
Oh, very cool.
But yeah, I mean, I loved all the diversity, and that's the kind of thing that I want to see. But I just wondered about that because it's so different. I mean, it's probably the kind of thing that they would have loved to have had on screen if they had, infinite budget to do things, right? To have that kind of variety.
Mm-hmm. One thing about this storyline in the present day, and I put that in quotes, present day. So T'Pring, she was out for revenge on Spock, which caused all this succession stuff going on. I thought that seemed a bit of a stretch, but I reread that today because I had to go back to that. And the second time I read it, I liked it better. But the first time I read it, I just thought, really? All this is because she just wants to get revenge for Spock? Because...
Yeah, it's interesting. I was going to bring that up in a little bit because that's the one criticism that I've seen of this novel, that does it really make sense that T'Pring would, hold this grudge and want to have revenge after... I think by this point it's been 8 or 10 years since what we see in Amok Time. And I was thinking about that as I was reading it this time, and I think it makes sense in the context of a bit of what we were talking about before. Not all Vulcans are the same or would react to the same way to the same situation. So she seems to be the kind of person that may have some more trouble kind of mastering those emotions, and they can come out. And I mean, I think that the explanation that's given is that basically, there were these events that happened before she got to marry Stan, but he died not that long after. So it's kind of because I guess she felt because of Spock, she wasn't really able to get what she wanted. But and there are some other parts that explain it. But I was fine with it. I mean, it's probably not my favorite part that the whole motivation is because of this one person, really.
Yeah, she felt like Spock had taken things from her, and
she was going to make him suffer.
Yeah, because Stan was gone. He died because he felt like she was really kind of still pining after Spock or something. Anyway, but her whole thing was, so in revenge, she found these factions of Vulcans that didn't like being part of the Federation and of Earth, and so she just fed into that because her idea was, you took away from me, Spock, so I'm going to take Earth away from you.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, or Vulcan away from you if he decides to stay in Starfleet, right?
Right.
It's kind of interesting because I think that could be, the one part that I might have wanted to be a little different, because it would have been interesting, because we've seen it in some other, parts of Star Trek and novels where there are these kind of rumblings from Vulcans about, not being happy with humans and the Federation. They're not logical and all of that kind of stuff. It could have been interesting if it was just a movement, but I guess in the novel, Diane Duane needed some kind of, focus to that and why it was happening now instead of, when the Federation was founded or something like that.
Mm. It did, seem kind of convenient that there was this whole conspiracy that was able to be exposed to kind of turn it around in the 11th hour. But at the same time, that makes sense to explain why it happened so late in the history of the relationship between Vulcan and Earth and the rest of the Federation.
But it's like it was one of those things where it was like, okay, maybe that could have been improved, but it's not like it really took away from my enjoyment of the novel. It's just
for sure.
It's just one of those things where it's like, I wonder if that could have been a little different.
No, it's like, oh, okay, that's how they wrap it up. Okay, that makes sense.
Yeah, and it makes me wonder if she's more powerful within society, holds a higher position within the Vulcan society than maybe I've attributed to her before, and that way she was able to do what she did.
Could be. I don't know if we really find out much about her, her family or her background.
That's another book I'd like to read.
So we do
Spring's
find
world.
out by the end of this book that Spock's family and Sarek's family, and it's just I don't know if this was established earlier or not, but there's kind of a throwaway line almost that, Sarek is now the head of the House of Sarek.
Yeah.
So
Well, and that also
that's interesting.
T'Pau
So
is part of
Spock's
that
family-
house as well, right?
yeah, so that family, Sarek's family and T'Pau, they're descended from the house that Sarek belonged to. So I guess, if T'Pring was marrying into a influential member of that family, I guess we could probably surmise she's from a very powerful house as well, I guess.
Yeah.
I mean, and I don't know if that was established in any novel before, but it is interesting. And I guess it makes sense for kind of the important position that, Sarek has in society and was able to do this thing for the first time, to have a child with a human. It makes a lot of sense. And I really like seeing T'Pau in this novel as well. It was really interesting kind of where she's come to at this point toward the end of her life. And you see some of the backstory in one of the Vulcan chapters as well, that she was the one that convinced Sarek to go to Earth and learn more and give reports back, and was kind of like, in a way, had a long-term plan to link the two planets more together. And it's like at the end of her life, that work was finished. So I really liked that part. And it was really moving as well when they had, I guess, her funeral procession, and like 3 million Vulcans come out for it. That was great. And I love that T'Pau was in this novel, and you got more of her story.
Yeah, definitely.
Yeah, and I thought it was interesting too that she placed her Katra in Amanda.
Yes, but that I hadn't even remembered that from the first time I read it, and I was even the second time I was like, oh my goodness, I've forgotten about that. So like Amanda has T'Pau's Katra, and like, whoa.
But it doesn't seem the same way as like Spock had his Katra in McCoy, where McCoy's kind of fighting the Spock's influence. I don't feel like. I feel like T'Pau actually died, but maybe just like an echo of her, maybe in Amanda, but doesn't have an influence.
I think it's a little bit different here, because for McCoy, at that point when you take Spock's Katra, it's not like he's had much experience with Vulcan, I guess, if you set aside Spock's world. But in like for Amanda, like in this novel, it's established that she learned the Vulcan language. She'd been on Vulcan before she met Sarek, and she's been living on Vulcan for quite some time, probably, 50 years or something like that by this point. So I think it makes sense that she would more naturally kind of accept that.
Not to mention that McCoy didn't even know that it had happened. Like,
it was like,
he
come
was
here, I got
unconscious
something
at the
for you.
time.
What?
Yeah, like he was unconscious at the time. He had no idea what had happened. And Amanda, like you said, she has all this experience and all of that, but she also went into it willingly and knew what was happening too.
Yeah, and might have been prepared for that eventuality also. Maybe, I don't know, but I don't know. It kind of worked, and you could see, like in the writing, how Amanda has changed somewhat with having that knowledge and kind of spirit of T'Pau. It was very interesting, and I actually liked that a lot as kind of a final way to bind Earth and Vulcan together, because they explain that if they were to vote for secession, effectively they would have to exile T'Pau's Katra, right?
Yes.
Wow, that made a lot of sense. That. Yeah.
And who would have known how this book would have ended, that the vote was against secession? So Vulcan is still part of the Federation.
Now, what's interesting is that, like, if you look at the vote, it's something like 35 to 40% that are still against. So, like, what happens with those people that are, disgruntled enough to want to get out of the Federation? It's a fairly sizable chunk. Like,
it was
4.5 billion people.
Yep. Yeah, exactly. Yeah, because they first announced how many voted for it, and it was like 4.5 billion. It's like, oh gosh, wait, and then it's
9 billion against. Like, wow. Yeah, but that's a lot.
They all cheered.
Yeah, but that's a lot of people that want to leave, and what happens with that? I don't know. It's there's just so many interesting aspects of this novel. We could go on and on, I'm sure.
Yeah, we could. So Justin, do you think you would go on and on about this novel if it was the late 80s and you were on your, I don't know, whatever computer? I'm trying to think of a computer, your Apple IIe. I don't know.
Well,
and,
let's
and
see.
you're in a BBS.
Yeah. No, I know we wanted to talk about that because like this came out in 1988 and Diane Duane is talking about a BBS, which for those who aren't familiar with it was a bulletin board system, which was an important way in the early days of people connecting online to kind of, trade messages and information. And I don't think a whole lot of people were using something like that back then in the late 80s. I certainly wasn't aware of it, although I was a kid at the time. But like that she puts that in and that there's kind of this like online anonymous interaction on the Enterprise I thought was really fascinating. And people are talking about current events and arguing, and people are buying and selling stuff, and they have to have admins to moderate the stuff. And I thought it was interesting that the admin, or sysop as they call it, has to like have a psych evaluation to be able to handle the stress and anger of like reading all this stuff. I mean, like, and you think about that 30 years later, like, yep, online interactions could do that to you. I mean, it was very prescient, and I think it was based on her own experience. I think she even has like a thank you at the beginning of the novel to some of the sysops or admins at CompuServe, which I didn't even know existed in the late 80s. I thought it was from the 90s. But anyway, that was fascinating for me to see that kind of online interaction. What did you guys think?
I thought it was too. I mean, I'm glad you had put that in the notes. And yeah, you're right. She's thanking the SF forum on CompuServe. I had no idea it was around in the late 80s too, because I didn't get online and all that stuff until 1995. And so to see this in 1988, I mean, obviously, yeah, it existed back then, so she can refer to it. But what really got to me was the different online messaging that she was putting in from members of the crew or from Vulcan. And it's like, oh my gosh, this is the same type of, like, the way people are like posting messages and arguing sounds like what I read on Twitter or Facebook or whatever every day. It's like the same thing. It was like, it's so like nothing has changed. If you think online social messaging is too negative at times, this has been going on for 30 years.
Mm-hmm. Absolutely. I was wondering if this book had been written in 2018 instead of 1988, would it be like Spacebook or something instead of, and then I started thinking like the idea of like an internal enterprise Facebook, like that's an interesting idea. That's really cool.
I mean, I find it fascinating also because, even if you think about like in Discovery, which is like coming out in 2017 and 2018, there isn't that kind of interaction you see in Spock's world, like in like things that are happening on the ship where people are trading messages and doing stuff. Like somehow it's still been difficult to integrate that kind of thing into Star Trek, but it's only natural that you would have that kind of thing, right? And that kind of interaction. But like even, when you think about like the Next Generation, it's almost like people are just, every once in a while getting like a video email, right? There's no interaction happening like on the ship, which is weird, right? From our perspective. But I love that she put that in there and was doing it in an early date like that. And that, like, I think it makes you realize like, it must just be human nature for people, how people interact with these things, no matter what decade or how many people are involved, if it feels the same, because you read that and you're like, okay, that's people arguing about current events. That's like a Craigslist ad. I mean, like there's all this interesting stuff in there that
I swear I heard Trump tweet something in one of these chapters about fake news or something.
Yeah. I mean, and it's all anonymous too, right? Which is interesting.
Yeah.
Yeah.
It's all, trading memes that are, pictures of T'Pau with impact font wording on it or something. Make Vulcan great again. I don't know.
Yeah.
Oh my gosh. Yeah, it's so true. And then there's that computer.
The computer with the personality, Moira, that's apparently the mystery poster posting like Taoist philosophy. Like but like I thought, but that's another part that was interesting, that there was this seems like sentient computer that's on the Enterprise. Like, wow.
Yeah.
Well, and the idea that like a misspoken, telling a computer to do something or allocating certain resources to a computer and bam, it can turn sentient. And I mean
That's
We would
Moriarty.
see that in elementary Dear Data. Exactly. That's how create a compute or create an opponent capable of defeating Data. Like that's what flashed through my mind.
And this is like create a computer capable of supporting party planning. Poof, sentient.
Yes. And McCoy even convinces her to help him in his research and pulls these records off of Vulcan that are classified. And just tap right in and pull them out. It's just crazy.
And Kirk at the end is like, don't do that again, but we'll get you a raise. And I'm like, this computer gets paid? Okay. That was kind of a delightful thing. And actually it reminded me very much of like in the more recent novels with Data, where he has a ship and it has this sentient personality. You guys know what I'm talking about, right?
Oh yeah.
Right.
It reminded me very much
from the
Cold Equations. Yeah. It reminded me very much of that kind of personality. That was delightful. I liked reading that a lot.
Yeah, she had a very distinctive voice somehow too, which was a lot of fun to read for sure.
Mm-hmm.
So, speaking of voice, I think it's time we voice our final thoughts. So, I'll throw it to our guest, Justin. What are your final thoughts on Spock's World? Which I think I already know, but let's hear it.
I'm sure nobody would be surprised based on how I've been talking about it that I love this novel through and through. And actually, like I think I've said before that this is in my top 3 along with A Stitch in Time and the Destiny trilogy. But in rereading this and kind of like looking at the perspective of it as a whole and everything that it's doing, it surpassed those for me. It's my all-time favorite above, even those or any of the other 150 novels I've read. I love the writing. I love the characters. I love everything we learn about Vulcan. I mean, we've talked about it for an hour and a half, and I feel like I could talk about it for a lot longer because again, like the wisdom of Sarek, the history of Vulcan, this secession movement, McCoy's speech. I mean, there's so many things that are a favorite that like it felt like every chapter was my favorite chapter. So this is my all-time favorite now. And I will give it 12 out of 10 Vulcan inner eyelids.
Wow.
Because
That's
I gave A Stitch in Time
thing.
11 out of 10, so this has to be higher. No,
Excellent.
really. I mean, I wrote a review in some Facebook groups. Like, I can't praise it highly enough because I just love every bit of it, every single bit of it.
Cool. Dan, do you feel the same way?
Yeah, I have to echo a lot of those sentiments. I mean, this is just an incredible novel, and upon rereading it, it's just as good, if not better, than the first time I read it. So, we talked earlier about fitting it in with Star Trek canon. There's a lot of ways in which, Star Trek canon has moved on since then. But, this is still just a really relevant, really great novel in a lot of ways. And one just thing I wanted to slip in before we completely finish talking about it. I always imagine that, when the final vote comes, or not the final vote, but when the vote to end the discussions comes in. I always imagine that Michael Burnham was standing in the wings ready to be the next person on stage. And they're like, oh, everyone stop. We've reached the threshold. And she's like, oh man, I wanted to talk about my experiences, but oh well.
And then she walks behind stage and then her half brother walks up and he's like, are you okay? And she's like, yeah, I'm okay. I just have a lot of pain right now. And he's like, you need your pain. Let me take your pain away from you. Oh, it's Cybok. No.
Oh my goodness. Oh boy.
Wow.
Yeah.
It resolves all the continuity issues in one fell swoop.
No problem.
It does.
So what would it be? Admiral Burnham at that point?
I would like to think so, yeah. But I mean, I can't rate this one highly enough. I would have to give it, maybe 5 found diamonds in the Vulcan system that we have to argue over what we're going to do with, because it's so great. I love it.
You can retire now. All those diamonds.
Awesome.
No. The diamonds stay with the podcast. You can't retire.
Be careful of the thoughts that might get sent.
We have to still do the podcast even though we're rich now. Darn.
Oh, darn.
You do that because you
Talk
love
about
doing it
Star
no
Trek
matter how
diamonds.
much money you have, right?
Absolutely.
Totally.
Yes. Actually, if we could do that, we'd probably do this podcast no, we couldn't read that. I was going to say we'd do this podcast every day, but we can't read that many books in a week or whatever.
Nope.
So No, but I really enjoyed this book too. And there isn't much more I can add to it that you guys haven't said already. I probably would say I like this book more now than I did the first time. And it wasn't that I didn't have this high on my list before, but because I've read so many Star Trek novels since, and coming back to this just shows how good this is. I mean, because there's so many Star Trek books that I think are just fabulous, and this to be that high up my list really says a lot. So I will give this book 12 out of 12-legged, 12-eyed, meter-tall spiders.
All right.
Excellent.
Now, by the way, does that spider Castelic appear in any comics? That would be interesting.
I don't recall the spider.
Not that I recall, but I could be totally wrong.
Because that would look really interesting.
That would. It might be. We'll have to check that out. And also, I just want to throw out. I was just curious because there were so many books back then that were done as audio books on cassette and then CDs, and I did not find Spock's World on Audible. But it looks like there was one read by Leonard Nimoy and George Takei. They both read it, and it's available as used CDs or cassettes if you can find them online. And it looks like on the CDs there's 3 of them, so it's about 3 hours long. So
interesting.
Also, quick side note here: Castilic is actually on the cover of The Wounded Sky.
I was seeing that, in the background.
Oh, I am too. I was searching while I was talking.
Very interesting. It looks kind of like a jellyfish.
It does.
Fascinating. Well, I've definitely got to read that one as well. Man, so many Diane Duane books I need to read. I've only read 2 of them so far, but that'll change soon.
Excellent. Yeah, they really are worth it.
They are. So, Justin, when you're not reading Diane Duane books, where can people find you online?
Well, you can find me elsewhere on the network co-hosting Earl Grey. That's our dedicated Next Generation podcast with Amy Nelson and Richard Marquez. We have a great time talking about the Next Generation each week. You can also find me hanging around the Babel Conference on Facebook. And as well, I want to mention that I'm a part of a couple of Facebook Star Trek books and comics groups. The Star Trek Books Community Group, the Star Trek Books Discussion Group, and literally Star Trek. So you'll often see me there posting reviews, like of Spock's World that I did today, and interacting there. So I love to talk about Star Trek books there as well. Oh, and you can find me on Twitter. I'm at TrekFan4747, where I tweet about nothing but Star Trek. And I tweet a lot about Star Trek novels, and soon I will be tweeting out my Season 5 rewatch of The Next Generation.
So, wow, talk about an episode heaping praise on a Star Trek novel. I think this is the first time in a while that I remember everyone giving a perfect score, and in Justin's case, a better than perfect score to a novel. Spock's World, I think, definitely floats to the top as a real winner.
It really does. I think if anybody were to come to me and say, well, I don't know. Now that I think about it, I was going to say, if anybody came to me and said, I've never read a Star Trek book. What should I read? This would be, if someone came to me and they were like a hardcore Trekkie that loves the original series or loves Vulcans or whatever, I would definitely recommend this book. Mm-hmm. I mean, maybe it's not for like the more casual fan that wants something maybe a little different, but I think for hardcore Trekkies, this is the thing to go with.
Yeah, I'd say that's definitely, like I said, this is one that I recommend if you had to read one Star Trek novel, this should be it, I think. So, yeah, I would definitely agree with you on that one.
Well, it's been fun talking about one of the best Star Trek novels that we've read, but it's not the only thing we've been talking about here on the network. So here's a quick look at some of the other things you may have missed elsewhere on Trek FM.
Previously on Trek.fm. To the journey!
They could go on vision quests together.
Yes.
So instead of seeing Janeway and Chakotay doing that, it would be Chakotay and Seska.
Can 2 people share a vision quest? Does this even make sense?
I think so.
How does it happen without telepathy or without...
You need the Akuna. You know, that thing that Chakotay puts his hand on and then it says Kuchimoyo? It's the Akuna. So as long as you're both touching the Akuna, you can be in the same vision.
Do you know that back in ancient Earth they had an Akuna too? It was in Africa. They called it the Akuna Matata.
I knew you were going to go there because I was about to go there. Hakuna Matata. What a wonderful gadget.
The 602 Club.
Yeah, I think you're absolutely right. I think it's definitely one of the big, I would say, two central themes, in my opinion, of the film. And like you said, I think that those are archetypes, right? It's the story of life. It's the story of growing up. And those are very clearly delineated in the film.
The Ready Room.
When I wrote the companion book, I knew of basically this moment in time, but I had no idea that this specific memo had been written, much less that it still existed. And yes, so I was just gobsmacked, as Marina would say.
Earl Grey.
Just within the episode, the arc of the nanites going from like these annoying beings that you want to sterilize and get rid of to ones where you can come to an understanding for their point of view through data at the end, and then they can found their civilization is amazing. And I just love that moment when that understanding happens, because I love when conflicts like that are resolved through understanding and in a nonviolent way. So that's my moment.
And that's what else is happening on Trek.fm.
Check out all these shows and join the conversation about your favorite corner of the Star Trek universe and beyond. And you'll find us wherever you get your podcasts.
If you're an Apple user, that means you're probably finding them on iTunes. And while you're doing that, be sure to hit that subscribe button in Apple Podcasts on iPhone, iPad, or Apple TV, or the desktop iTunes app to get the latest episodes as soon as they're published. And if you have the time, we'd really appreciate it if you'd leave us a star rating and a written review and share your thoughts on the show. If you're not an Apple user, we've got you covered as well. You can find all of our shows from Trek FM on Google Play Music, Stitcher, TuneIn, Spreaker, SoundCloud, Windows Phone, YouTube, in most third-party apps, and you can stream and download the MP3 file from our website, and you can grab the RSS link there as well.
If you'd like to help us keep our shows coming to you each week, the logical thing to do is become a patron of the network on Patreon. Visit patreon.com/TrekFM. That's patreon.com/TrekFM. Perks include early access to episodes, exclusive content, producer credits, and more logical things available through our special patrons website, Patron Zone. And it takes a great deal of money to produce, host, and distribute these shows each month, so we really appreciate your support that you can give us. And join the team by going to patreon.com/TrekFM. And hello, we have feedback from iTunes. On iTunes, we have a review from Lost Trekkie 1, and this was posted on February 11th, 2018. And the title of it is called Great Podcast, and it's got 5 stars. Oh, wait, this must be the wrong one. Oh, no, wait. No, it's the right one. We are a great podcast, Dan. Look at that.
Who'd have thunk?
Who would have thunk? And it says, I've been reading Star Trek books since I was a little kid and loved them, but never really had anyone to talk about them with, even with my closest Trekkie friends. And honestly, some of my favorite Trek stories are from the bookverse. So this podcast is an absolute joy to finally have deep and engaging discussions on a sadly underappreciated side of the Trek world. The hosts are fun, engaging, and give well thought out analysis of the books. Even episodes about books I hadn't read were interesting, and they clearly warn about spoilers if that bothers you. If you love the Trek books or just want to hear more about stories you may not have heard from the wonderful world of Star Trek, this podcast is well worth your while. Well, we thank you, Lost Trekkie 1.
Yeah.
And I'm with you. I never had anybody to talk about the books with either for the longest time.
That's exactly how I found the podcast too when I first started as just a listener. Was, nobody was there was nobody I could talk to about Star Trek books. So, if we could bring that conversation to you each week or almost every week, we're really happy to do that and happy to share that with you. So thank you so much. Those really kind words.
Well, if you want to hear anybody else's thoughts on today's show, Dan, where can they go?
Well, there are many ways for them to do that. It's not limited to just a BBS system on the Enterprise computer. The best place you can join in the larger conversation is in the Babel Conference, which is our listeners group on Facebook. Just type Babel, that's Babel, into the search field on Facebook, and it should come right up. If you'd like to send us an email, you can use the form on our website at trek.fm/contact. Choose to send to a show and select literary treks, and that'll come right to me and Bruce. And you can also find the network on Twitter at TrekFM and on Facebook at facebook.com/TrekFM.
And you can find us on the Goodreads group on Goodreads.com. Just go to Goodreads and you can find our bookshelf that shows you what we've read, what we are currently reading, and what we are going to read in the future, so you know what books to read before the shows come out, so you can keep up with us. So just go on Goodreads and search for Literary Treks and click Join Group. And so we'd like to thank Norman C. Lau, Ken Tripp, Greg Rosier, Brandon Shea-Mottola, Justin Oser, who was just on, and Jeffrey Harlan for their support of the Trek FM network and being associate producers for Literary Treks as well. So Dan, when you're not in a tribe on Vulcan searching for water and about to take over some other tribe, where can people find you?
Well, I'd probably be trying to develop those mental powers. Some of those sounded really cool. But when I'm not doing that, you can find me on Twitter. I'm at Kertrats. That's Kertrats. I'm also on YouTube. I have a YouTube channel at youtube.com/Kertrats Productions. And now that Discovery's done, I'm doing a lot more Star Trek book reviews. And those videos don't seem to get a lot of views. So I don't know. If any of the Star Trek readers listening to this want to see some video reviews of Star Trek books, go check that out. You can also find me on facebook.com/Kertrats Productions and, of course, in the Babel Conference talking about Star Trek. And Bruce, when you're not standing in front of a group of assembled Vulcans giving a TED talk about why Vulcans should stay in the Federation, where can we find you?
Should Vulcans separate from the Federation? Hell no! That's what McCoy says. Hell no. Well, you can find me on Twitter. I'm at Admiral_Rex. That's Admiral with the underline, then Rex. And you can find me talking Star Wars on the Star Wars Report podcast. You can go to StarWarsReport.com or find it anywhere in your podcast apps or wherever you listen to podcasts and that sort of thing. And, you know, when Discovery was on, I was doing Live from the Edge, the sub-show to the Edge with Brandy Jacola, or Jacola. I was corrected on that, but she doesn't care if it's Jacola or Jacola. That's what her and Dave said. So I don't know. I'll go with Jacola at this point. So, but those will start up again possibly when we get to season 2. I don't know. We might restructure things. I don't know what we're going to do. But anyway, you can always find me in the Babel Conference. So thanks everyone for listening. And until next time,
live long
and read on.
What do you call that, light reading? To each his own, number one.